Hey guys, how's it going? In this segment with Dr. Dario Nardi, I talk with him about the personal development of the personality types at a very practical level. He gives some really practical advice, all the way down to a very deep and profound level of understanding of personal development. We talk about age-related development of the types as well as function-related development of the types. And check out the video I have earlier in this channel. If you want to see Dr. Dario Nardi live, I have information in that video about how you can see him live on November 14th because I'll be hosting an event then. And also definitely check out Dr. Dario Nardi's book as well.
I think ultimately the question when we talk about development is like, how can we help the person better? And if we can say, oh, the person is in the part of the spiral that's like in the grip for them now, that's really important to know.
Mm.
And if they're in the grip and they're, like the harmonizing style, what does that also say? Like, does that, as people aren't stuck with their subtype, the whole point is it's the result of nurture, so they can
Right.
shift. I don't think quickly, but within a few years, that's what the brain imaging suggests. After a couple of years, people can shift their brain wiring.
Mm.
Um, that it gives more tools to understand where are we and where can we go next. And
Hmm.
as a person who's like the creative subtype, I'm not going to push them into normalizing because that's like at the diagonal end of things.
Right.
So don't push them there. For the person who's in the dark grip, what they need is healing, not reprimands or punishment. And so how can we bring healing? And so it's like it's almost thinking in terms of Jung's alchemy lab. It's like and I'm not a professional coach,
Mhm.
but providing these kinds of materials that say like, okay, when a person is in this space and this space and this space, what are some good like tasks or like activities or whatever it is for them to develop? Assertiveness that culturally usually looks like the analytic version of extroverted sensing, the mover, or the manager version of TE.
Mhm.
And it's like, no, there's an assertive FI and there's an assertive NI. There's even an assertive SI.
Mhm.
And what do those look like? And for an ISFJ who comes in and being told like, oh, you need to be more assertive at work as a manager, like you should be doing like assertive TE, like that is so probably off their radar.
Mm.
And
Right.
it's like, oh no, wait, there's like an assertive version of SI
Mhm.
and of FI or FE, and like what does it look like? And I do believe that people can, especially for their preferred functions, can develop both sides.
Right. Yeah, and there's a way to like really rehabituate the brain. So it's not like where it's a constant struggle to develop a different aspect of yourself. I feel like once you set the intention and then you move towards that intention, then it starts to become part of you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it's we know that through adult life, the brain continues to be pliable, not in the same way as when we're 5 years old or 10 years old, but it does. And the really fascinating thing is that in personality psychology, traditionally personality was defined as those traits of the person, or characteristics was the original term, which remain relatively stable or constant over the person's life.
Hmm.
But they have found in these longitudinal studies, mostly using five-factor model or something like that, but it doesn't matter. Like it's just in general, what they see is that when they assess people at 5 to 10 year intervals, they don't see much change. But over the course, now that they've been running some of these for over half a century,
Mm.
and they're like, wow, if you compare somebody at 15 and then 65, they may be very different in terms of their characteristics.
Wow.
That there's this like slow but steady change from one end to the other. That doesn't mean everything changes, and I certainly am one of those people who believe like your dominant function is your dominant function.
Mhm.
Your auxiliary may at times eclipse it, based upon the demands of environment and whatnot. But the capacity to grow and to shift the expression of our type and to integrate the other parts of ourselves, which might just mean making allowances. That those we do have tremendous capacity, but of course not everybody does those things, and in fact many people don't. Um, and that's like, it's very clear to me, uh, when somebody has not developed their sixth function, for example.
Hmm.
It's the INFJ who can't answer when I ask, like, what do you want?
Hmm.
What's important to you?
Hmm.
And to me, it's like, it's, I mean, I would try to think, I work on my sixth function too, but of course there's always room to grow. And then there's even room to grow in the dominant function. And I
Yes.
do believe what the folks at Personality Hacker advocate, that if you're unsure, and especially in the first half of life, like, darn it, just work on your auxiliary and do more of your auxiliary, because it's something that's already like sort of a strength, and you can build it up, and you would be surprised at how much suffering and anxiety you can alleviate by simply shifting to your auxiliary.
Yes. Yeah. I have a friend who's an INTP, and he calls because we kind of get into a loop between the first and third function. He calls the second function the call to action in the heroic journey.
Yeah, yeah, and that's and it really is. I don't address so much in the book the dynamic between the first and third, but I know what it looks like in myself. It's and yeah, it's very plain in every type,
Hmm.
and it's something to be aware of. And I do love, by the way, that this is not something that people were talking about before the internet started discussing.
Hmm.
The type forums with amateurs started discussing this. It was something that, yeah, some Jungians like sort of vaguely talked about, but it was not part of the MBTI community to
Yeah.
be talking about these kinds of things. Um, and conversely, there are some things that even now in the traditional MBTI community, the professionals who don't get involved in any kind of internet forums or whatever, that are lessons that it's like, no, that wheel has already like rolled and been explored and developed. And like, people ask like, oh, what is the relationship between like autism and type? I'm literally like, there's like a dozen published studies on that. Like,
Hmm.
just Google it. Like, you don't need to have like an exploratory brainstorm. Just Google it. People already did that work in the 90s. And that's, yes, you weren't born yet. I get it. But like, go look and you'll see it. So there is stuff that's like really great, which I think that both can learn from each other. And I do believe that the book reflects some of the concerns and the advances that people have made that are on like the amateur side,
Hmm.
and that's great because it really reflects like where some needs are.
Right. Yeah, I'm really excited about the whole entire development of things. I feel like when I'm developing NI, I'm thinking less about what I want and thinking about like what's best
Mm.
in a way.
Which is a nice step up from just like, oh, is my room like have good feng shui or not? Because I read about that randomly in an article,
Hmm.
which is fine. Like that's sort of a cute thing to think about. But to me, I'm like, oh, that's something I thought about when I was 12. And it's like, no, you can grow your NI from that point. But there's and how good it can look, the sixth function in all of the types when it's well developed, and I think is a great starting point. I do believe, though, it is the fourth and fifth function, particularly the fourth, where the magic really starts to come around. And I would want to add, when people are probably wondering about the seventh and eighth,
Hmm.
that my advice is to not try and develop those in terms of like doing it different, doing yourself differently.
Hmm.
Like, ISTJ should not try and do extroverted feeling to replace extroverted thinking,
Hmm.
because that's like their gift is extroverted thinking. Like, don't buckle under. Like, you're going to end up losing your gift. But what I do suggest is that everyone needs an insurance policy,
Hmm.
and covering the bases that would be covered from the seventh and eighth functions is really valuable. So it's like for INFP, you don't need to go out and do this like, oh, I'm going to build a business around extreme sports and it's going to be like, like you're going to be getting yourself into like these extroverted sensing situations.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be something like, I'm going to pay attention to my health.
Hmm.
And I'm going to do just some extroverted sense. And like many times for NE, the challenge is like actually just doing something. So
Yeah.
what are some ways I can do something? But to cover certain bases, so that because I find that people can go even through midlife and ignore their seventh and eighth functions. But now getting old enough where all the people in my parents' generation are people in their 60s and 70s, and if they did not cover their bases, and I think this is particularly true for intuiting types, we're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh no, introverted sensing is stupid, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, or extroverted sensing, like I don't need to do that. Oh, that has come back to bite them really hard
Mm-hmm.
because there wasn't even making space for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, you really do want to like respect it. You don't have to do a whole bunch of it in your life, but cover that base. So
Yeah.
for INTJs, it's like use your extroverted thinking to do some financial planning. So because our society assumes that you're an ISTJ, not an INTJ, but just like do it. Like just do like some financial planning stuff, have like a stable home base, have a retirement plan. That's not like inherently introverted sensing, but it is about having stability for the future so that when you arrive at age 80, you're not like still working on your umpteenth creative project, but you like live in a hovel.
uh, when you mentioned that, I was kind of curious. Is this based on the sociologics idea of like SI being a role function, so you appear as an ISTJ, and that's what people expect? In a way, is that?
I know what you mean. I didn't base it on that. It was for the seventh and eighth, it was based on two things. One is John Beebe's work on what do the first and the eighth have in common,
Mm-hmm.
which is really great. So like the first and the eighth, what I'm trying to remember um, for introverted feeling and introverted thinking. I don't remember the word that he used. But what it is that Jung described other functions besides the mental functions. There's a religious function, there's an aesthetic function, there's a philosophical function, there's some other function, the social function.
Mm-hmm.
And these are not functions in the way people think about like the functions, the like type. Um, the transcendent function is also a function. Like that's, but what TI and FI carry in common is he called the philosophical function. That both of them develop a philosophy of life,
Mm-hmm.
and they want that philosophy to be right, and they work in their lifetimes to arrive at the right philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And one is very subjective and personal, and the other one is like articulated in a way and arrived in a way that the person themselves need never have even existed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a set of principles that are universal that have nothing to do with the person at all, except that person was like a carrier for developing it or like whatever it was. But they both shared that in common. And I thought it was so interesting that SI and NI have in common what Beebe and Jung described as the religious function.
Mm-hmm.
And he went religious, though, in a spiritual sense, although it often shows up religiously, that both of them are concerned with, they're both storehouses of impressions.
Mm-hmm.
This one is very concrete impressions, and the other is very abstract impressions. One of them shows us as archetypes, and how do we embody the archetypes? So NI, and the SI, I don't quite understand it. Being, of course, that's my eighth function. But there is this body of impressions that sort of form what is life and civilization in the most concrete senses,
Mm-hmm.
in meanings, and or practices, ways. Um, and so by the time that an ISFJ and an INTJ reach like 80 years old, assuming that they've developed to some extent their religious function or spiritual function,
Mhm.
they actually can be completely on the same page. They
Mm.
may even have different beliefs, like one of them is like Hindu and the other one is Catholic or whatever. But there's like this certain path that they're like, no, no, we totally get it.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so that was one inspiration. And then the other one was simply observing anecdotally all of these people that I know in my parents' generation in their 60s and 70s. And I hate to say, for the most part, all the ways that they realized there was stuff they fucked up.
Mm.
And that almost always has to do with disrespecting and ignoring the seventh and eighth functions,
Yeah. Hmm.
which ultimately actually winds back around to harm the first and second function and undermine them.
Right. Hmm.
And it becomes, and then the person sort of self destructs. And it's a tragedy in a way. And I think that's what can happen is that it becomes a tragedy. And and that's okay. Like many people, their lives they do end in tragedy. So that's the way it happens. But it needn't be that way. And if people can start covering the bases, and that's the phrase I use, um, then it will be okay.
Yeah.
Like they'll really find that when they enter that last act in life, which presents the seventh and eighth functions, often from the outside, because Jung meant that one-sidedness is often by neglecting things in the definite world, as he called it, the material world. We neglect things, um, and it's like the ISTJ who suddenly realizes that their life practices and say their devotion to their religion has provided no actual personal meaning or like transcendent spiritual experience. Like they attended church for 75 years and they never had the transcendent experience that the saints supposedly had.
Wow.
And they're like, wait a minute, is this like all made up? Like, how come I didn't have this experience? I'm not saying that they think about it that way, but that's like my point of view of it.
Hmm.
And then for them to actually, but life is like, no, 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 wait. You're in your last act in life. Let me give you that transcendent experience. And then they're like, oh my God, what the hell was that? And so when my ISTJ dad told me about his transcendent experience, which as far as I know, he's told no one else, as the NI person, I'm like, dude, I totally understand. Like, I don't think that's weird at all. Like, I totally get it.
Mm.
And for him, it was a profound sense of like coming full circle and of completion. And I really think that that's the same. Like the ISTJ or INTJ who finds their community, the FE, like real community, that's a profound sense of completion.
Mm.
And I'm not saying for people listening who are like 25, like you don't need to think about that now. But no, it's like it's in the playbook. By the end of the film, it's going to come.
Mm. Wow.
And put a bookmark there and put a little timer on your calendar. You can do that now. You can put a calendar thing for 20 years from now.
Yeah.
I don't put it 20 years. Put reminders every 5 years, or like once a year, saying like, "Hey, how's that coming? Hey, how's that coming?"
Mhm.
And I think it can be really beautiful when we attend to it.